This unit's going to look at two aspects of the environment. We're going to look at species and we're going to look at habitat. And ultimately what I want you to kind of be thinking about as we go through this is, if you are going to be in charge of saving the planet, are you going to focus your efforts on saving individual species, or are you going to focus your effort on saving individual or different habitats? Because each one has pros and cons in terms of what you can accomplish by focusing your efforts on either species or on habitat. So we're going to start with species. What is a species? Species are organisms that can reproduce and produce fertile offspring. The development of a new species is called speciation. This can occur because of geographic isolation, meaning that one organism or a population of organism ends up becoming physically separated or isolated, and then over time they merge into two different species. Or it can be behavioral that can cause the development of a new species. So basically looking at mating rituals, coloring, those types of things that causes species to only mate with a certain species and not another species, and then over time new species are formed. Speciation is a very slow process. It's important to recognize the two aspects of the definition, which are organisms that can reproduce, so they can actually fit together to reproduce and produce a fertile offspring. They have to have both. So for instance, a mule is a donkey and a horse. The donkey and the horse are physically able to reproduce, okay, but mules are infertile. So the offspring that they produce cannot produce its own offspring. Now, oftentimes when two species reproduce, they're so genetically different that fertilization won't even take place to begin with. But there are occasions like the mule where fertilization can take place, a new organism can be formed, however that one would be infertile. We put species into two categories, generalists and specialists. Generalists have a very broad niche. The best example of a generalist is cockroaches. People say that if the world comes to an end, the cockroach will survive. That's because they're very flexible within the environment. They have a very high reproduction rate, meaning that they're producing tons of cockroaches at any given moment. They're very resilient, and they care for their young for a short period of time. So basically they're only worried about themselves. Specialists are the exact opposite. So a giant panda is an example of a specialist. They have a very, very narrow niche. They require very strict habitat requirements. Pandas only eat bamboo, very, very little of anything else. They have a very low reproductive rate. Pandas maybe have one child in their lifetime. They care for their young a lot longer, meaning that they're not just looking out for themselves, they're caring for others. And they're a lot less resilient, meaning that if there's a disruption in the ecosystem, they're less likely to be able to survive that. And because they reproduce really slowly, then these are going to be organisms that are going to be at greater risk for becoming extinct. Interesting question, are humans generalists or are humans specialists? It's a very fascinating point of debate. You can Google to see the different arguments if you'd like. The role of a species, the ecological niche basically means that every species has a job or a place in an ecosystem. So the way that a species obtains food, the relationships that it has with members of its own species, as well as members of different species in the ecosystem it lives in, services it provides, all of these are referred to the ecological niche. So when a species becomes extinct or endangered or off-kiltered, even overpopulated, these different things, that the roles that they played, also become out of balance, and thus the ecosystem becomes out of balance. So maintaining a balanced ecosystem is really important, because if you have too much or too little of something, then the food chain is completely disrupted, the relationships among the different organisms is disrupted, the services that are provided or that are needed or that are left over are also disrupted. We measure the number of species in an ecosystem by looking at two factors, diversity and abundance. Diversity is the number of different species per unit area, and abundance refers to the number of individuals of a species in an area. So abundance really refers to population. Diversity looks at all of the different species. So if you're looking around in your classroom right now, diversity would be, the number of humans, the number of bacteria floating in the air, the number of fungus floating in the air, the number of bugs that are walking around, those types of things. Organizing species within the environment, we start with individuals, then we go to species, which I already defined for you, members of the same group that can reproduce and produce fertile offspring. The total number of species in a given area is called population. The total number of populations in a given area is community. The total number of communities in a given area with the same kind of climate is called an ecosystem. All of the different ecosystems that have the same types of climate, the same types of living things that exist in them are called biomes. And then finally the biosphere, which would be our planet, the thing that holds all of the different biomes. So going from smallest to largest. Individual organisms need energy. This is an important job of species. Obviously, sunlight is the main energy source for living things on Earth, and remarkably underused. Only 3% of the sun's energy is used by living things. Some organisms can make their own energy or food. They're called autotrophs. Some organisms have to get their energy or food from other sources, and these are called heterotrophs. Humans are obviously heterotrophs. Plants typically are autotrophs, as well as some different species of bacteria. Food chain just represents a one-way diagram of how organisms get their energy, showing what is being eaten by who. Each level here is called a trophic level. So we start with the sun. The autotroph gets its energy from the sun. Primary consumer eats the plant or the autotroph. They get their energy then from the autotroph. A secondary consumer then eats the primary consumer, getting its energy from that. And then a tertiary consumer eats the secondary consumer, and it gets its energy from that. Each one of these levels is called a trophic level, and each one of these trophic levels transfers approximately 10% of the energy from one level to another. So 10% of the energy that's found in the plant gets used by the primary consumer. 10% of the energy in the primary consumer gets used by the secondary consumer. 10% in the secondary consumer gets used by the tertiary consumer. So tertiary consumers don't get as much energy as an autotroph does because they're losing 10% each time it goes up the trophic level. You're going to be doing an activity looking at energy flow in a ecosystem, and this is one of the questions it talks about is the loss of 10% as you move up trophic levels. Food webs are a much more complex picture or diagram of an ecosystem and how energy flows, because obviously organisms don't just eat one thing. They eat a lot of different things, and they're interacting with different organisms in terms of eating and being eaten by. And so food webs are just a better description of what's happening. There are relationships that exist between organisms, and we call this symbiosis. There are 4 major relationships that can occur within organisms. Number 1 is competition. This is going to be interaction between organisms that are sharing the same resource. So if you're in an ecosystem and let's say you have 2 organisms that like to eat squirrels, they're going to compete for those squirrels. Okay? The winner, the one who gets the most squirrels, is going to be able to survive, reproduce, and the one that doesn't isn't going to be able to survive and reproduce. So if organisms are in a competitive situation and they find themselves losing, at times they're either going to have to leave the population to go find what they need or the ecosystem, or they're going to not survive or find a new resource to provide them with whatever the one they were competing with did. Food, shelter, space, water are all things that organisms compete for. Survival of the fittest is just, again, the idea that those that are able to get the resources they need are able to survive. If they're surviving, they're reproducing, they're passing on their genes and their genetic information to other generations, and the population and the species can continue to thrive. Those that can't won't survive, won't reproduce, and eventually could find themselves in a situation of becoming endangered or extinct. Nobody wants to compete. Even the winner doesn't want to compete because it's a waste of their time and energy. Both organisms expend a lot of energy fighting over the resource, and they don't want to. They would rather spend their energy reproducing, honestly. That's the ultimate goal of every living thing, is to reproduce. So if they're wasting their time and energy competing, then they aren't using that time and energy to reproduce. So organisms, winners or losers, do not like competition. Predator-prey. This is a winner-loser situation. One organism consumes all or one part of an organism. So herbivores consume plants, carnivores consume animals, omnivores consume both. Humans are typically omnivores. And parasites consume animal and plant tissue, typically ones that are already dead or decaying. One person wins, they get the resource that they need. The other organism loses because they lose their life in the process. Although not always, there are some examples of predator-prey relationships where the predator preys on the organism for a really, really long time. Fungal infections, bacterial infections, and it might not actually kill the organism, but most often the organism is not going to end up surviving because that relationship will prevent it from living. And again, if it's not alive, can't reproduce, that's the ultimate goal of living things. Cooperation or mutualism. This is a relationship where two organisms help each other and both of them benefit. The best example of this is bees and flowers, both living things. Flowers need the bees to help them pollinate, and bees get what they need from the flowers. So pollination is a cooperation or a mutualistic relationship. They help each other, they both win. Lichen is another example. This is fungus and trees. Ants and aphids are another great example of mutualism. The relationship between these helps both species survive. And then last is commensalism. Commensalism just refers to the interaction in which one organism benefits and the other organism is neither helped nor harmed. Basically, the other organism could care less. The best example of this are barnacles and whales. Barnacles sit on the surface of whales, and as the whale swims through the water, water flows through the barnacle and it's able to filter feed and get the nutrients that it needs. The whale could really care less whether or not the barnacles are on it or not. It's not bothered by it. It's not harmed by it. It just doesn't care. Same with the sea anemone and a clownfish, if you ever watched Finding Nemo. This clownfish lives in the sea anemone. It gets nutrients from it. It also gets protection from it. The sea anemone could care less whether or not the clownfish is in there or not. It's not harmed by it. It's not bothered by it. It's just there. So commensalism is kind of like a win and null situation where one organism benefits and the other one just doesn't care. Those are the relationships that exist between species. The next lecture video will look at the role habitat plays in the species' ability to survive.